Management Plan public meeting. The meeting is being recorded, and that's so we can post it online for anyone who couldn't join us today. We do ask, because we are recording, that you just hold your questions till the end. We will have the opportunity for you to ask questions. And then if you see something and think of it, feel free to put it in the chat, then we can come back to it and you can reference the slide that we're on. And I'm Shauna Warner. I'm with Neighborhood Services. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alex Jovanovich with our Parks and Rec team.
Good afternoon. I'm Alex Jovanovich with Community Services, Parks and Recreation. I'm the Community Services Deputy Director for Parks. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the second workshop public outreach opportunity for the Hayden Butte Papago Preserve Management Plan. I will keep this really short. Just want to encourage anyone, if you are able to make it this evening at 6 o'clock at the Transportation Center, the Don Casano room.
Shauna, can you hear us?
We will have an in-person meeting this evening at 6 o'clock.
Is it very loud?
Hey, Wayne, Alex is talking, but yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I get it.
We'll have the public in-person meeting this evening at 6 o'clock. And if you are able to make it, encourage you to come. There'll be some maps and some other information presented that will give you an opportunity to make some comments on and write on and put sticky notes on. So that way the Logan Simpson team is able to include those comments and information into the draft plan. With that, I will turn it over to the Logan Simpson team, and Wayne, if you want to jump in. Wayne, can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, if you want to go ahead and jump in and just let me know when you're ready for the next slide.
We're ready to roll then? I'm sorry, we lost the speaker for a second.
Yes, go ahead and jump in whenever you're ready. Let me know when you're ready for the next slide.
Okay, super. Well, welcome everyone. Those of you who joined us. This is our second workshop for the Papago and Hayden Butte Preserves Management Plan. And with us today from Logan Simpson is myself, Wayne Colbank, and John Southard, who is our lead historian at Logan Simpson. You've met Alex and Shauna, I believe. So let's go to the next slide then. So today's agenda, looking at the third bullet point down there, the purpose of the preserve. One of the things we want to do, which is different in this meeting than the meeting that we had in November, is to try to zero in a little bit more on the kinds of language and goals and objectives of the preserve as these preserves were established. So we have some language from the ordinance. Then also for Papago and Hayden Butte, we also have some language that was part of the resolutions when they were formed or allowed. And it gives us some indication of the kinds of things that the city was thinking of at those times about how these preserves would be used. We'll revisit the intent of the management plan. And then we'll discuss really the purpose of this meeting today, which will include a short presentation here, which this is the beginning of it, which will identify some of the resources that we've already found as part of our study. And then the bulk of the project or the presentation, what we want to talk about are how we see uses and other activities in our programs being carried out in the preserves. And we definitely need your input and your thoughts on that. So next slide, please. So just moving right into that, and to help us sort of think more appropriately about the preserves, we pulled from the ordinance that was established in 2002 these three primary purposes that were established. And you see the first one is to establish habitat for vegetation and wildlife and to protect archaeological and historic resources, but also provide public access. The second one is that the purpose of the preserve is to keep these land areas as in a pristine state as possible, so that they can be maintained and preserved for many future generations. Lastly, the third bullet point of the preserves is that they're not to have traditional facilities or improvements such as playgrounds and turf areas, things like that that would be find in a standard park. But they could have improvements and facilities that are necessary to support the preserve objectives and activities. Next slide, please. Now, a little further, as the Papago Preserve was in process, and the ballot language for the vote, the public vote that happened before it was allowed, further drills down onto the objectives of or the goals of the preserve. And you can see here it's to provide cultural, educational, recreational opportunities designed to heighten the appreciation and the enjoyment of the natural Arizona desert. So again, we're really starting to drill down here, and you can see a very more refined purpose and use for, in this case, Papago. Now we have some similar language on the next slide that was developed in 2002. I'm sorry, Papago was 2018, and Hayden Butte was in 2002. But again, the language here, as part of the resolution, focuses on maintaining a natural state with some appropriate public access and use, but to conserve these spaces as natural habitat with some level of public recreation. So now that we have thought a little more about it, now we know a little more about how the city's perspective was on these preserves. I think it gives us a good framework to think about how we're going to move forward here with some of the ideas that are part of this conversation today and the meeting that will happen this evening. Now, again, this intent of the management plan, for those of you who attended the November meeting and or have been following otherwise, these are the purposes here are to try to guide some of the decision-making about the uses and operations in the preserve. We want to maintain a healthy ecosystem and preserve any of those recreation assets that are already out there. Definitely, we want to identify any resources that need protection or restoration, and to identify and integrate recreation, sustainable recreation and educational opportunities. Ultimately, this study will result in us recommending some specific best management practices and procedures that could be used over the long haul to further those goals and objectives of the preserves. And lastly, one of the other elements of this study is to identify potential funding sources and partners that could help along the way. Next slide. So the purpose of the meeting here, drilling down on just what we're going to talk about today. The first point up there is to clarify the purpose and the use of the permit. So we've just gone through those things. And we all now have a better understanding of that. We then also, as part of this, we're going to share with you some of the maps of some of the resources that we have looked at and identified in each of the Papago and Hayden Butte preserves. But where we really want your input here on the meeting is these bullet items here on the slide. And the first one is the role of the preserves. Now, this one is takes a little bit of extra thinking because there's a couple dimensions to it. One is right now the preserves are serving primarily as recreation areas for hikers and bikers, those kinds of activities. Could the preserve become more used in different ways or more comprehensive ways, still preserving the natural areas, but are there other roles that the preserve could take on in terms of incorporating municipal uses or other activities and programs? And then one other dimension to that is the role of the preserves. There's a question about whether the preserves could reach an iconic position. Much like when people think of Tempe, they think of Mill Avenue, they think of A Mountain, Town Lake, ASU, things like that. But could the preserves reach that iconic level as well over time and be notable and be notable for the city as just another incredible resource and evidence of sustainability efforts by the city. The second bullet point down is, what are the opportunities for more diverse groups? We know that there are folks in some of the disabled groups that certainly may not be utilizing the preserves as much as they possibly could, but those would be folks that would have to be aspects would have to be identified for them, for that user group. And then the third bullet point is, can the preserves be more involved or more integrated into community or neighborhood activities? Could there be neighborhood meetings? Could there be functions of the neighborhood that could be carried out within the preserve, again, preserving the naturalness of it, but maybe there are temporary uses, little tent cities or things like similar to that, where you could have events that take place. And of course, the fourth bullet point is really trying to get at what might be some of those programs or uses that are compatible with the preserve's objectives. And the last bullet point again is, who are the potential partners in some of those programs? And some of the partners could be folks that are very recognizable names like the Audubon Society or Nature Conservancy, or even more locally Liberty Wildlife, organizations like that who would have an interest in conservation here and preservation of these areas, who might be able to offer support and assistance. Next slide. Here's the schedule where we are. You can see that we're still in the data gathering phase. So, but we will show you some slides of some of the information that we found so far, but you can see that data gathering goes just a little farther here into 2024. And then we'll start focusing on developing those management goals and best management practices and other actions, recommendations for the city to take on these preserves and treat them with full gusto of the city's resources and partners that might be involved. Next slide, please. So here are the preserves again. Those of you in the earlier meeting saw these, but these were over just some line drawings. We put the boundaries over an actual image so you can see where they lay and lie in and around all of the different infrastructure and urban context that we've got here. Next slide. So we have, in addition to the kinds of natural resources that we've been looking at and recreation resources, there is another component of the study, which is the cultural resource aspect. And I'm going to let John discuss what's been going on there, and so he can explain all that to you.
Thank you, Wayne. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Southard with Logan Simpson. So the cultural resources component is a very important part of this effort. The O'odham and their ancestors, the ancestral O'odham, commonly known today, the O'odham as Pima, they have lived here since time immemorial. These landforms are of great significance to them. And we wanted to ensure that in this effort, their views are not just collected, taken into account, and really incorporated into the end product. So in order to do this, we went back and looked at what has been done thus far, what needed to be done, and then developed our plan of action from that point. Hayden Butte Preserve has been the subject of rather intense study over the course of several years. There's a great deal of documentation as to its significance, as to its cultural resources, etc. That was not the case with the Papago Preserve. And so in deciding upon the project scope with the city, one of the really key elements that was incorporated early on was a class 3 survey, that is going back and looking at all the literature that exists related to historic and cultural resources in the Papago Preserve, and then going out and actually walking the preserve and identifying and re-identifying, relocating known and new historic and cultural resources, so that we had a very accurate understanding of what exactly is out there. And then, of course, taking that information to the tribes that are being consulted in association with this project. The lead tribe, as this is north of Baseline, is the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. However, the Gila River Indian community is also asked to be involved with this effort, and so they are. We're meeting with representatives of their tribal historic preservation officers and other members of their leadership, members of their community, to ascertain the significance of these lands, these features to them, and work to identify means by which we can protect those areas warranting protection and otherwise take into account their considerations. As we move forward here, we have a team of ethnographers who are going to engage in a traditional cultural property study. That is working with tribal representatives to identify what areas in the two preserves may be considered traditional cultural properties, that is, properties of exceptional cultural significance to them, more specifically as defined by National Register Bulletin number 38 on traditional cultural properties. Once we have this information, that will help in the shaping of management recommendations and best management practices that ensure that the cultural sensitivity of areas within both these preserves is respected and taken into account in planning. Wayne, that's really
Okay,
the overview on cultural.
okay. So next slide, please. So we're going to share a couple of the maps that we have developed so far to record things that have been seen or found in the preserves. And the first one we're going to start with here is what we're calling contemporary features. And these are actually visible things that you can see out there that exist. And this does not, the contemporary features map does not include trails. There's a separate map, and we'll see those in a second. So this is really beyond the trails, what is out there. And a couple things that you notice right away. The green line is essentially the maintenance road that connects to Rio Salado Parkway. And right behind the mills area there, it kind of does a loop, and then it basically shoots right up the side of the hill up to the tanks and to the stairs that go up to the summit. So that's a feature that's there. Obviously the A is there, the tanks are there, and then the yellow squares are really representing the holiday displays that show up once a year, or maybe a couple of times a year in this area. So those are really all the things that are generally permanent or temporary as it relates to the displays. One of the other things I want to point out to you here is that on the western boundary of the preserve, you will see that it has kind of a, at the north end, kind of a stair step, jagged shape. And then as it comes south, it loops back into what is essentially the light rail tracks. That line right there is a line that was established as part of the city's development proposal, and they were accepting proposals from developers, and that is the boundary between that development and the preserve. So that's how that line was struck, in case you were wondering why that looks that way. That's exactly what that is. So next slide, please. So this slide is shows the trails and the trailheads, and you will notice that right off the bat we've got along the light rail trail in the southwest corner or southeast corner, you've got the trailheads that are there. The darker green lines are the trails that are actually there. that one could see. One could have called them in contemporary features, but since we broke down the resources into trails, that's how they got there. You will notice on the west edge, there is a indicator for a trailhead that goes there. It's in orange because it's not there yet. As part of the development agreement with the city, there is an agreement that there will be direct access from Mill Avenue to the preserve. Now that is a long ways out. It's not designed. But there is an intent that there will be access there, and one would assume there would be a trailhead of some sort, not knowing exactly the design style of it, but it would be there to allow people to come from Mill Avenue directly and get up to the top where the tanks are. The dashed lines that are more of an olive green color, hopefully the colors coming through here, that are generally on the north and kind of the northwest side. Those are basically the spider trails or unnamed trails that are out there. Those would likely be in future recommended for rehabilitation and restoration. Next slide, please. This map is the vegetation or flora map. The majority of the map is this brown tannish color, which represents basically standard Sonoran desert scrub material. Some of the other colors represent different things, like right in the middle, there's a yellow area right along the maintenance road that goes up to the tanks. There are quite a number of barrel cactus in those areas in there. We didn't plot individual plants, but there's quite an area in there. So those are unique in this particular setting. Similarly, the dark green, which is along Rio Salado, and there's just a little bit on the very southeast corner, are areas of mesquites and other similar type of tree vegetation. What would you call these drainage? They're actually representing drainage areas, but these lines that look like they're light green lines that are falling off the slopes. Oh, thank you. Those really are vegetation types associated with some of the primary drainages that are in there, and it's a different type of vegetation. Primarily, it means it's a more dense vegetation. So that's kind of some of the mapping, and we will be documenting the various species that are in there relative to those. So next slide, please. On the Papago, we have a similar parallel group of maps, which we call the contemporary features. And what you see here is that up at the north end at Evelyn Hallman Park, we have quite a variety of things going on there, as one would expect, in a more developed setting up there. But you've got certainly the Ramadas, and you've got the trails, and you've got the lake, and you've got a number of different things associated with that, which show up on this map. If you look at the rest of the map, you see very little in terms of features. Now, we're not talking about landform features or vegetation type here. We're just talking about what things are built or are out there that you could visibly see. And a lot of it happens down in that southwest corner, down near Moore Park, and right along the 202 freeway there in the southwest corner. Lots of different things happening, including the trailhead that goes up to Loma del Rio. But otherwise, the features are generally along the periphery on the outside edge of Papago Preserve, which means that the primary core area of the preserve is pretty much just natural desert. Next slide, please. Here, the trails and trailhead map. The obvious thing that you can see is south of Curry. You can see many of the trails there have been named and are used and recognized. North of Curry, you see very little in the primary and the main body of Papago Preserve. The one that sticks out is the green line along the west edge of the Papago Preserve. That is the Crosscut Canal Trail that extends pretty much the whole length of that western edge. And then again, of course, you've got some identified trails in Evelyn Holman Park. But again, very limited in terms of trails, identified trails in the core portion of Papago Butte. And it suggests that much of the use is happening south of Curry, where those two have been developed. And those of us who have been out there, we recognize there are some improvements that we'd like to make to those trails. We won't get into that as kind of discussion here, but just so you can see that there are differences within the portions of the preserves just based on use of trails. Next slide, please. This is the same type of vegetation map as we saw for Hayden Butte. And the one obvious thing that you can see is that except for very limited perimeter type differences in vegetation, that almost the entire Papago Preserve is a monoculture of desert scrub, Sonoran desert scrub, with some intrusions here and there, but mostly along the edges. So from that standpoint, maybe not the most exciting in terms of vegetation, but it does have some very exciting areas, such as the Lopiana mesquite bosque. You've got the Green Line, which is over near Arizona Heritage Center. And then, of course, you got the vegetation around the lake up in Holman Park. So those are just some of the maps here I've shared with you. We've got about 20 maps of different resource types, including electrical things, and power poles, and walls, and other kinds of things that will be ultimately integrated as part of the report that will be generated here. But you can see some of these, and some of these will be available in hard copy to look at the presentation that will take place tonight. So moving on to the next slide. So now we really want to get into the bulk of the meeting here and identify some of the potential uses and programs and activities that could happen that you might be interested in having the city take on and incorporate into the preserves. And again, these activities would have to be consistent and not do damage to the preserve, but could be activities that could occur. So you see, let's just start with the photos on the right. Up in the upper right, you see someone who might be doing some stargazing. Don't know if that actually occurs at the moment in any formal way. Some people might go out there, but could be done. To the left of that, there are some banners representing maybe there's a temporary setup of some kind where there could be an event, a training session or something that could occur that does minimal to no damage to the preserve. Below those, you can see one of the suggestions was yoga in the preserve, which you would have some areas where people could come and do things like Tai Chi and other kinds of activities. In Holman Park, you do have a couple of ramadas there, and ramadas creating shade, create lots of opportunities for doing outside activities, whatever those are, arts and crafts, painting, you name it, but that ramada is certainly an opportunity. And then, of course, the photo on the bottom is really about how can we get after dark activities that might work in the preserve. In this case, it just happens to be some video or movie showing out there in this particular example. But you can see on the left, we kind of generated some ideas here, including docent guided hikes, self-guided tours, tours that are focused about history or history or prehistory, trying to tap into whatever tours might come along with Town Lake and have them walk up into the preserve so they get another dimension of what it's like in Arizona and in Tempe. All of these other kinds of activities that, depending on how they're structured and set up, could be very compatible with the preserve itself. And we're not suggesting all of these, we're just throwing these out as ideas and really want your input on how those might look or how receptive you would be to those. Next slide, please. So then, of course, the real purposes here between recreation and education and conservation. So just under education, we've identified a number of slides here, things that could be done, kinds of things that activities that could be consistent with the preserve goals, including measuring plants. This could be a climate change measuring laboratory in some sense, where people measure the trees, the vegetation, the ground cover, look at the soils and determine if there's any changes in the soil. There's just all kinds of things. One item here is rock talk for geologists and others interested in some of the larger rock formations. But from the standpoint of education, how much could we expect that school groups might want to come and undertake activities here as a learning environment, an outdoor learning environment. So we're looking for your ideas here about how you see some of this stuff might be happening in the preserve. Next slide, please. Of course, conservation is really the focus here. Obviously, everything we do must preserve and conserve the resources that are out there. And some of that has to do with just cleaning up the place and solving maybe some minor erosion issues here or there, but taking advantage of volunteers and or others, city staff that might be responsible for these kinds of things, and just use this site as a way to keep it natural and in an harmonious way with Mother Nature's patterns. And you see there's a monarch butterfly there. Many of you may know that the city of Phoenix now signed on as a monarch butterfly city. Don't mean to put Tempe in competition with Phoenix, but certainly there are other species that could be identified as important to the city that people would be very interested in, and the preserves could be part of that process. Next slide, please. And of course, volunteers. We know the city has been working with groups, probably more smaller groups up until this point, but there's always a need in the preserves for things like vegetation, restoration, erosion repairs, just lots of cleanup activities, maybe even some replanting. And how much can you really, and how much do you want to see these kinds of groups really being out there, being highly active? And you've got things such as site stewards, which those folks can oversee, monitor archaeological and cultural sites, things like that. You have your ambassador program. Of course, you've got the forget the group that is already there, the acting as the ambassadors to help everybody try to figure out where they're going and what kind of resources they might be able to see. But certainly volunteers can be a big component in particularly large areas like these where maybe city staff is not sufficiently staffed to take on some of this. And certainly there are groups that are very philanthropically oriented who want to come to these places and do these kinds of things. So there is a marriage there possibly with some of these groups. Next slide, please. And of course, when you start to develop activities and programs and you get things on schedules, one of the things you need to do these days is have the ability for those who are interested to be able to reach out and find their way as to which activity they might be interested in, which activities they're excited about, and how they get to linked up to, let's just say that they want to become a member of Preserve the Preserves in Tempe. we'll just call that an organization. How would they pay their dues, or how would they contribute to that? Well, obviously these days online participation is one of the easiest ways to do that, but you've got to have mechanisms set up for folks like that who either want to do some physical work or donate some things to be able to reach out and to make their wishes known. So you've got to have, with all of these things, you've got to have some infrastructure to accommodate those kinds of needs. So again, these are ideas that we're throwing out here. Nothing has been decided about any of these. We're really looking for input from the public to tell us how you feel, or if any of these strike a chord with you. So I believe, if we go to the next slide, I believe this was the last slide of the presentation, but this slide here is really trying to hone in on a little bit of where we need your insights, which the first bullet point is how can the preserves become more integrated into Tempe's identity? And that had to do with, whether or not they could be part of the iconic elements of the city of Tempe, and how they could further benefit the Tempe community in general by being an area where things could occur and activities could happen. Lots of questions like that we're hoping you can really give us some solid information about how you see what the neighborhoods need or want, and how it could work within these preserves. And if you know of any partners, certainly we're willing to and want to hear what you have to say about any of those folks who could really help support making these preserves the kind of place that the Tempe residents would be proud. So I believe that is the presentation. Oh, sorry. Yes, you can provide your input. Much like the previous workshop, we will have the ability for you to provide comments, recommendations, thoughts through the city's website, and that comment period will go to about February 14th. And at that point, we'll gather those up. The comments are all being documented and will be put in a report of this management plan process. So if you do make a comment, you'll see that eventually in the comments, probably in an appendix somewhere. But we look forward to your comments and appreciate your time today in participating with us, and look forward to more exciting information to come as we go forward. So with that, Shauna, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Wayne. And thank you. We did have, we'll capture everything in the chat, so we appreciate you sharing the trail maps. We had a couple options there and there, as well as a comment about no movies in the preserve. People will not stay on trail for that, and it adds to deterioration, and overhead airplane noise would not make a film watchable. So all of that will be captured and recorded, but this is your time. So you could either put a question in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. And the team's happy to take any kind of questions or comments or input based on the information that was presented.
Shauna, just one thing to bring up real quick. So just to tag on to the survey that is now open. This is a follow-up essentially to the first survey. So for those of you on the meeting call that were able to participate in the first survey, you'll see in this survey there's a few more specific questions building upon the first survey questions, taking the information that was gathered from that survey and narrowing down a little bit of the focus on some of the highlighted topics that were presented to us from the community in the first survey.
Okay, so just a comment in the chat to note that the climbing areas are being used by the community within Papago Park. Any other questions or comments? Again, you're welcome to come off mute and ask a question if you have any. Okay, so question if there's plans to improve the tunnel at all.
So there are no recommendations at this point. Again, we're in the data gathering stage. I'm not aware if there are any planned CIP projects for the city. I would defer to Alex on that.
Yeah, we don't have any planned, as of right now, any planned improvements. We recently just updated or improved some of the lighting through the tunnel. If you're talking about the tunnel that goes underneath Curry from the south side of Papago Preserve to the north side, we did improve the lighting there recently, within the last 6 months, we'll call it. But we don't have any additional planned improvements there unless there's some type of recommendation or best practices that come out of the management plan.
Thank you, Alex.
And then Kelly asked if we saw the messages above about the trail map and moves in the preserve. Yes, Kelly, I can reply in the chat. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but I had mentioned both and that those will be noted. We save our chat, so we'll have that as well. Okay, got a thumbs up, so we're good there.
And I'm happy to go back to any slide in the presentation as well if someone wants to refer to a map or a picture.
And then just another comment about wanting to see more outdoor education areas for scouts, possibly camping. Okay, not seeing any other questions. So Alex, I don't know if you want to wrap us up. Again, the direct link for the forum is in there. And as has been mentioned, we'll be in person at 6 p.m. here at the Tempe Transportation Center here in downtown Tempe, next to the Hayden Butte Preserve. And then a question about an example of signage for the preserve. And I don't think, Alex, I don't know if you want to reply, or I don't think we're quite there yet.
I'm sorry, the question was about an example of signage.
If we have an example of signage for the preserve?
We don't have a visual representation of an example, no. If you're talking about, or if the question is regarding what types of signage, so it could be wayfinding signage, trail map signage, educational or cultural amenity signage. So all those different types of categories, but please provide us your input, suggestions, recommendations on types of signage that you find helpful and appropriate for the preserve. Both either in the chat now or through the survey.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate your time today.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.